Okay, I was telling you that I've been working in my country for the judicial branch for 25 years. I was a prosecutor for 15 years, um, and for the last 10 years, I've been in charge of the Gender Equality Secretariat for the Judicial Branch in Costa Rica. This institution in my country is very complex because unlike other institutions in other countries, it unites not only the judiciary, but also the prosecutor's office, the public defendant's office, the specialized judicial police, and from 1989 on, also the Constitutional Court. So it's a very complex institution. We see all the parts of the justice chain, the whole procedure in all the areas, and that has given us a special know-how. Also, I'd like to share with you that from my post in the Gender Secretariat, we have worked many international cooperation programs. Specifically, we have worked with Eurosocial, with USAID, with the United Nations Fund for Population. Also, we have many programs with the State Department of the United States. But the main program that we have implemented in international cooperation was with the Inter-American Bank of Development. And this made an absolute impact and difference in gender mainstreaming in my institution. The first part of the loan didn't have gender mainstreaming, and that was from 1995 to 2003. It was for $11,200,000, and an equal amount was put by our institution as a counterpart. And the second part of the loan was from 2003 to 2010. And that was for double the amount. That was for $22,400,000 with an equal amount put by our institution. So everything that was invested was through this program that was called Program to Modernize the Justice Administration System. And the important part of this, and the reason why we had gender mainstreaming in the second part of the loan, was because we implemented Beijing Platform for Action and International Cooperation. The bank negotiated with our country so that the law that implemented the loan said that every single project within the program had to have gender mainstreaming. And as an anecdote that I would like to share with you is that through this loan, they created the Gender Secretariat in the year 2003. And something that always calls my attention is that the Department of Planification made this big report that justified the existence of the Secretariat. And for the first time, probably they read CEDAW and other international instruments on women's human rights. But the fact is that the last paragraph of the report said that it was really important for the Secretariat to start working because it depended on that for the bank to give us the first payment. So actually, everything depended on having the Secretariat working so that it would be able to implement all the different actions for the gender mainstreaming. And that is to tell you the power that you have within your posts to introduce gender mainstreaming in the institutions. First of all, and here we go with the presentation, it's very important for you to have in mind that almost all governments throughout the world have adopted CEDAW. Also, there are other instruments that are regional, like in Latin America, the Convention of Belém do Pará, that makes it mandatory for governments to have to make gender mainstream in every action that they take when they design public policies, when they implement programs, services, and so on. And the other thing is that from your posts in international cooperation, you have a very big power, which is the economical power. And keep in mind that I'm talking to you from the other side, which is the government side, as a government officer. And governments, we are always looking for funds because our budget is never enough for what we need to do. So that's a very big power. From one side, you have international instruments that are telling the governments that they have to gender mainstream. We have governments that need the money to give the services and have the programs. So it's very difficult for a government to have arguments in order not to comply to these requirements. There are instruments that you have to know in order to be able to negotiate with the governments and the institutions you're going to work with. CEDAW is basic. It's also basic to know all the different frameworks and legal frameworks from all the specific regions of the part of the world where you're working. The Beijing Platform for Action of 1995, and that's the reason why it wasn't implemented during the first part of the loan, because the loan was negotiated in 1994 when still Beijing hadn't taken place. So Beijing is very important because it established that all the governments that had ratified CEDAW would from then on gender mainstream in every public policy and every action that they would make. And it would be binding and mandatory for all of the international cooperation. So there's your main instrument since 1995, and I think it hasn't been used the way it should. And it is the way I convince my peers in my institution that we have to comply as government. And for you, it's basic because what it's doing is it's obligating all of international cooperation to gender mainstream. And why does it do that? Because after decades of working with gender perspective, changes were still very slow. So the agreement in Beijing was to gender mainstream and include it in every single action in order to see more, a better and faster progress in the recognition and respect of women and girls' human rights. The other instrument that is very important for you to keep in mind, and here would be basically would be to answer the question, why gender mainstreaming in the justice sector? Well, we have several reasons. First of all, CEDAW reports help us understand better the needs and make a more in-depth analysis of the country's situation, because it allows us to know where the gender gaps are. It gives us an overview of what's happening in the country at the economical level, the political level, the cultural level, and the reports that countries make to the committee of CEDAW allows us to see this. And not only from a government point of view, but also from the institutions that make the shadow reports to the CEDAW committee. So it's very important, the overview that we have of a country from the government's point of view and the other institutions, saying maybe that the government isn't doing what it should do in women's human rights. And that gives us a very important instrument to understand reality. Also, mainstreaming gender in the justice sector, it's strategic to advocate for a gender transformative justice sector and to support CEDAW domestication at a national level. Because even if we're having this worldwide phenomenon on constitutional laws changing in order to have constitutions even be, they're being having amendments or even being new constitutions, like in Ecuador, like in the amendment that was made in Nigeria to say that international instruments of human rights have the highest level within the domestic framework, legal framework. That means that all of these changes in constitutional law also gives you an instrument in order for governments to comply to your suggestions on gender mainstreaming. And the other thing that is very important to keep in mind is that when we mainstream gender in the justice system, this will impact the rest of the country's institution, both public and private. Why? Well, it's very simple, because in the justice system is where we interpret the law and where we set the standards of how law enforcement is going to be. There, the judiciary system is going to say what is understood by law. And if we gender mainstream in the judiciary, and we have been working, for example, in Costa Rica and in Ibero-America on protocols with models of how to gender mainstream in the rulings of the judges. That is going to allow us to address direct and indirect discrimination produced by the law. So when we gender mainstream in the justice system, we definitely are going to have an impact like this snowball going to the rest of the country. So that's why justice system is a priority sector in order to make advances in the recognition and effectiveness of girls' and women's human rights. And in this, something very important that I always keep in mind and I like to remember is that we have a gender gap worldwide. Every single country in the world has a gender gap. And I invite you, for those who haven't seen it, to check the gender gap report of the World Economic Forum, where they make the ranking of more than 139 countries worldwide. And something that comes right out of this report, which is for me one of the most important reasons why we should work in girls and women's human rights, is the relationship, the intimate relationship between human development and gender gap. When you see these 139 countries being ranked in indicators like political participation, economical participation, health and life expectancy, and education, those 4 indicators, you see that the countries that have the widest gaps in gender are the poorest countries in the world, are the least human developed countries in the world. So it's important to know then that when we fight against gender gap, when we set actions to reduce gender gap, actually what we are doing is having a front fight against poverty. And what we are doing is making more democratic societies that are going to be actually more pluralist and inclusive. So gender mainstreaming has to do with human rights, has to do with democracy, and has to do with human development. So when you gender mainstream in every single program, no matter what the topic is, no matter what the thematic is, because gender perspective is a methodology that has been built in order to be inserted in all areas, that is what you're going to do. You're going to have a front fight against poverty, and you're going to contribute to human development in all of these countries. Why also gender mainstream in justice sector? Well, you have 2 very important instruments. One is the SDG 5, to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And in this aspect, or in this SDG, there are 2 main targets that are related with justice administration and the justice sector in its total view. Target 1, that establishes the end of all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. And Target 2, which establishes to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. So there's a binding instrument for us to apply and for you specifically in this in gender mainstreaming. And also there's the European Union Gender Action Plan 2, Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, Transforming the Lives of Girls and Women Through European Union External Relations 2016-2020. And it was very rewarding to read what this establishes for you at the European Union. And it says, and I'm going to read it textually because I think it's very important, that gender equity is at the core of the European values and enshrined within European Union legal and political frameworks. The European Union and its member states are the forefront of the protection, fulfillment, and the enjoyment of human rights by women and girls, and strongly promote them in all external relations, also beyond development cooperation. And this is very important because for me, that I come from a country in development, it's very important to see that European countries share with the rest of the world the standards that they are enjoying. Because when I spoke about the Gender Gap Report and the relationship it had with human development, you can see that the countries that are at the top of the most of a better social economic society with more respect to human rights are those that have narrowed the gender gap, and they have done it in an 80%, and those are the Northern European countries. And you know, as I do, that in this century, no country can be considered an island. And all the phenomenon that we are seeing worldwide and the way that frontiers tend to disappear is something that has to be addressed through working together in order for human rights to be respected worldwide. So those standards that you have in Europe have to be shared with the rest of the countries. And that is very important. And the way, one of the most important ways and strategic ways to do it is to gender mainstreaming in all the programs. Because when we're talking about poverty, we talk about women and children. Because according to the United Nations, 70% of all people in poverty are women and children. And those children are in charge of women, are with the woman. So every time that you develop a program that is set to or has the goal of human development, you are definitely going to work mostly with women, because those are the most poor people in the whole wide world. Now, what is gender perspective? I think it's important to speak a little bit about that. And we can define it as a methodology to foresee the impact of public policies, programs, services, and actions on different groups of men and women. And here it's important to notice that it works with men and women, because gender perspective is not an instrument that tends to take the balance towards women. No, what it does, it neutralizes the androcentric vision of the world that patriarchal systems impregnate in all the different manifestations in a society and in a state. So it can be, since it allows us to see all the different relations of powers between the different groups of men and women, gender perspective can even be employed or used or applied in social phenomenon where even women aren't participating, where only men are. And I'm going to set here an example. In my country and most of the Latin American countries, one of the main reasons of mortality within young people are car accidents. So if you want to develop a gender sensitive program to address car accidents and death because of car accidents, you will find out that the actors of these accidents are men. Most of them are men, and most of them are young men, men from 18 to 30 years of age. So you can apply the gender perspective and make campaigns and address programs directed to men in these ages. And why with gender perspective? Because it has to do with the roles and the sexist stereotypes of what is demanded by society to men. And this is going to depend on on the different cultures in the different countries. That is why we have to study and make the analysis of which are those cultural patterns that are more or less stereotype, sexist, with sexist bias. That will depend on the culture in each country. Also, gender perspective allows to determine whether the impact will contribute to close the gender gap, broaden it, or have no effect on it. And our goal definitely is to close those gender gaps. And like I said before, it applies to men and women because gender roles concern both. In the justice sector, gender perspective helps also to detect prejudice and unconscious biases that are in the system. Because here it's very important not to assume that the law is neutral to gender. Because nothing is. Because law is a result of culture. So there is a gender bias, and during the making of the law, because the people who make the law, which usually are men in Congress, because they have more participation than women, they have their cultural bias because they are a result of their own culture. And that is going to be impregnated in the process of making the law. And that law is going to result in direct discriminations, like Marina talked to you about just a few minutes ago, and also indirect discriminations when, due to not knowing which are the needs of the woman that the law is going to impact, they don't see it, women are invisible, and when the law is applied, it's going to affect women's and girls' rights. So the making process of the law is not neutral to gender. The interpretation of the law by the judges is not neutral either, because they too are a result of society and the culture. So when they interpret the law, they are also going to introduce a gender bias in it, unless we do something to train them and to make them gender sensitive. And then at the last stage of the process, we're also going to have a law enforcement that also isn't gender neutral. That too is going to be impregnated by all the stereotypes and the gender roles that are in the specific culture where the law is being enforced. That is why it's so important to work with the justice sectors. It helps identify, like I said, direct and indirect gender discriminations. It insists that legal analysis must not assume gender neutrality in the law, and it helps not to perpetrate women's subordination due to law enforcement. And with this here, I have a lot of examples of how law can do that and law enforcement, but I think we're not going to have time for it. Okay, in this, not to insist in women's subordination due to law enforcement, we have in Costa Rica a perfect example with the law that sanctions drug trafficking. And in Congress, they thought that the criminal policy had to be very strong, so that the penalty at the least, at the minimum, would be a very high penalty, and it was 8 years of prison. So no matter if it was half a gram of cocaine or whatever drug it was, or tons, the minimum penalty would be of 8 years. What happened? How this impact women and kept the subordination roles in law enforcement. What happened was that, well, the phenomenon in all of Latin America is that 90% of the people that are in prison are men, and less than 10% are women. But of that 10%, in my country, and it's like that in the rest of Latin America, 74% of them were in jail because they took drugs into the jails for their husbands or sentimental partners. And it was women in poverty, and most of them were women in domestic violence. So what we did only 2 years ago was to push a reform, change in the law, and this came from the judicial branch, from the Public Defendant's Office. We worked with that, and we were able to get a modification in the law to establish that when the cases were about women in poverty with children and in domestic violence, and they had done this because of all of these circumstances around them, then the penalty would be of 3 years of prison, and that would allow them to get some benefits in order not to go straight to jail and be able to stay with their families. And we have been able to get out of prison to make around 110 women come out of prison 2 years ago, and none of them have committed another crime because we looked for jobs for them, and we gave them working capacities in order to go into the labor market. So that was one example that I wanted to share with you. Which are the gender gaps in access to justice? Well, we have many obstacles that women encounter in justice system. First of all, it's the different reports from United Nations and from the Organization of American States citate the following obstacles in justice system. There's a systematic impunity pattern. Generally, the prosecutor's office don't consider violence, gender-based violence, as important crimes. Organized crime is important. Drug trafficking is important, but gender-based violence is not as important. So budgets generally don't tend to go that way. There's a sensation of insecurity, helplessness, and lack of trust in the justice administration system by the victims and their families. And that has to do with the re-victimization processes. In a program for victims of sexual assault that we just redesigned 4 years ago in Costa Rica, we found out that a victim to report a rape had to make 9 different statements to 9 different people of the justice sector, to the police, to the prosecutor, to the forensic doctor, to the person in biology and in criminal sciences, to the doctor in the health system, and so on. 9 times the rape victim had to give a statement. And this has a very negative impact, and it's an obstacle in access to justice for women. There's also a lack of clear procedures, protocols, and bylaws. There's a lack of coordination and articulation among governmental programs addressed to victims, and especially those that have a multidisciplinary orientation. Because as professionals, we need to learn to speak the language of the different disciplines in order to assist women that need access to justice. And I like always to say that we need to have a holistic approach, because the person is an integration of mind, of heart, of body. And that means that we need all sorts of services to address all of those levels that implies being a human being. And there is no single institution, not even in developed countries, that provide all of the services that a victim needs when she needs access to justice. So that makes it, that means that we must work in an interinstitutional way and in a multidisciplinary level. Also, other obstacles in access